boards need to prioritise a range of different elements in order to ensure the company's long-term success. Now, profits are a short-term measure, and of course, all companies are supposed to be profitable. That's the idea of corporate structures. But they also have to do things like ensure safety, ensure long-term reputational issues are taken care of, and the company has good trust, because that goes to the long-term sustainability of the organisation, not just the short-term profitability.
In the wake of the Qantas and ongoing Boeing scandals, investors and the public are asking questions on corporate governance, risk management, and ethical conduct. With aircraft manufacturer Boeing embroiled in a quality control scandal that included doors blowing off mid-flight and allegations of defects at a key supplier, investors have questions. Australia is not without its own airline scandals. Qantas CEO Alan Joyce quit the airline in September following intense scrutiny from the national consumer watchdog for selling tickets on flights that did not exist. Today, we chat with Megan Motto, CEO of the Governance Institute of Australia, a professional association for company secretaries, governance advisors, and risk managers. Megan, thank you for joining us.
It's good to be here.
Our listeners are very keen to unpack what happened with these two companies and where to go from here. So first, let's break down the similarities you see between Boeing and Qantas from a governance perspective.
Look, there are a number of similarities, I think, but it really starts with issues of, well, I'll say governance, but sitting under governance, those issues of the pillars of governance, which is transparency and accountability, and that really goes to culture. So it's pretty clear that in both circumstances, there seems to be a culture where the board are not listening to some of their shareholders, whether they be internal shareholders, for example, engineers with regards to safety concerns and the people who are at the coalface of manufacturing, or it might be various shareholder groups or customers. And that disconnect of the boards and its understanding of what's going on in the company from those issues that are happening in the coalface are really core to governance, because they are a part of the culture of listening, of having transparency. It's not just about open door policies, but it's about really proactively creating a culture of psychological safety, of proactively going to listen to people rather than just getting reports coming through the filters of management, and really that culture of listening. So I think that there's a big similarity on both counts there.
So it's about communication and transparency. Okay, so let's talk about Boeing. What are the key takeaways on what could have been done to prevent these kind of safety issues that we've been seeing?
The safety issues were not unknown to the company, but the way that communication flowed through the company clearly, I think, needs to be questioned. Once again, issues whereby were the board listening directly to the concerns of engineers and people at the coalface in the manufacturing plants? So, and it's not just formal structures like whistleblower protections, they should absolutely be in place. But one would hope that there is a culture that is creating that psychological safety, that culture of listening, that culture of bad news travelling up to the board as fast as good news. And that would in many ways circumvent the need for needing to get to someone whistleblowing through a formal whistleblowing procedure. You need those whistleblowing protections in place, but they should really be for extreme scenarios where normal cultural circumstances have not been in place to allow for that transparency to flow through in of its own accord.
There is a strong view that the aviation industry is prioritising shareholder profits over safety. So how can corporate governance principles play a role in ensuring companies do make a profit while still prioritising safety?
It's a fabulous question, and it goes to not just the airline industry, but across many industries. And it's not just safety; they need to prioritise. Boards need to prioritise a range of different elements in order to ensure the company's long-term success. Now, profits are a short-term measure, and of course, all companies are supposed to be profitable. That's the idea of corporate structures. But they also have to do things like ensure safety, ensure long-term reputational issues are taken care of, and the company has good trust, because that goes to the long-term sustainability of the organisation, not just the short-term profitability. So in terms of governance structures, they need to have governance structures that adequately weight equally some of those different elements. Is the board agenda does safety profile on the board agenda as prominently as the financials? Does shareholder reputation, shareholder communication prioritise on the board agenda? So it goes from everything from board agendas, the focus that the board has, and then, of course, into remuneration structures. So very important that there are both financial and non-financial elements of KPIs for management. And I would imagine in an airline industry, safety would need to be one of those KPIs that focuses very sharply executives' attention and board's attention on safety as a significant, weighted issue for that industry.
Now let's talk about Qantas. It seems to have taken the Qantas board by surprise that the ACCC is understood to be investigating the ticketing issue under laws surrounding false and misleading conduct. So what do you see as the role of the board and executives in reporting issues and preventing these kind of communication breakdowns?
Once again, and I hate to be repetitive, but it comes down to that culture of transparency. Surely there were leading indicators that should have and could be reported up through the executive ranks and to the boards if there is an environment where bad news getting to the top is prioritised as fast as good news. And that is a really strong indicator of good culture. So those, and you saw this in the Banking and Financial Services Royal Commission, where it's not just aggregated, for example, aggregated consumer feedback through call centre data, but it's the outliers. What's going on with the complaints hotlines? What trends are we seeing early on? Those are the sorts of lead indicators that all people that are involved in governance of an organisation, so senior leaders and executives, but also obviously the board, they should be interested in those lead indicators because they give you very important information for what's coming down the track, and it allows you to address issues when they're still just issues rather than them becoming major crises for your organisation. So those sorts of lead indicators are very, very important, and the transparency with which they're reported.
Now, noting that Joyce reportedly sold his shares in June 2023, what are the normal governance issues and approval processes around selling shares?
Well, clearly there's layers, and I go back to the Royal Commission. It's just not about what can you do, it's about what should you do, because there is a number of elements here. There's obviously the regulatory elements in terms of communication to shareholders, to the disclosure requirements. So there's those sorts of requirements that are you must comply with, and the transparency of your compliance with those regulatory frameworks. But there is also clearly reputational and ethical issues here, and that goes to the perception of how that will be perceived and how that is handled from a broader perspective. And those sorts of questions should be asked as well. So it's not just a matter of, well, can you do it? Is it okay to do it under the law? Are you complying with the regulatory frameworks? But should you do it? Is now the right time? How will it be perceived? How will it affect the company more broadly? Those issues should be discussed also.
So usually the chair must approve the selling of shares, correct? There are minimum shareholding requirements for CEOs and executives.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about executive remuneration from an ESG and governance perspective. At what point does remuneration become an issue? For example, during COVID, it was reported that Joyce was still getting bonuses while everyone else was in a tough time.
This is a great question. In fact, I was speaking to the media only the other day about the correlation between in some cases, obviously quite extreme executive pay and the average annual worker pay increase that goes through the Industrial Commission. Now, to a certain extent, you're not comparing apples with apples when you're trying to make a theoretical link between those two things. One is, broad, blunt instrument, whole of economy, as are, workers' wages. You're talking about thousands of employees. So a 1% increase makes, big difference when you multiply it by thousands. But on the other hand, the sorts of questions that you're asking about executive pay are things like, is this person going to have the experience? Are we getting the best in the international competition market for talent? So the questions are very, very different. However, so there's a technical disconnect between those two arguments at a technical level. But in the minds of Joe Blogg shareholder or Jane Doe shareholder, there's a perception that there should be a fairness oversight. And so once again, this should come into the thinking of boards when they are setting the remuneration structures, which have to be disclosed and defensible, that they are taking into account these different perspectives and viewpoints, but that shareholder viewpoint, that community viewpoint is also one of the lenses that they consider.
How should investors view the departure of executives from Boeing and Qantas from a governance perspective?
Oh, look, I think that there can be, and it really is, once again, I think that you can't make blanket statements about some of these things because it involves the internal performance, culture, group relationship issues, which only the internal mechanisms of an organisation will be privy to. So only the board knows what the pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses of individual executives are, how they work as a team, etc. So it's not something to be, there's a blanket yes or a blanket no, it's good or bad. There are pros and cons, of course, associated with both of those things. So the pros of executive clear out can be that there can be cultural resetting, new ideas, fresh diversity, all of those elements. It can represent a break for reputational issues from the regime of the old to a new regime. So there can be really good reasons to have that clearing. However, on the other hand, what you lose is continuity of knowledge, all of that corporate information about how the organisation runs, and oftentimes some, really good relationships can be put at jeopardy as well. Relationship with key shareholders, key supply chains, for example. So there's pros and cons on both sides. The job of the board is not to have a template with regards to yes, do this, no, do that. It's all about the framework for how you bring diversity of thinking to the table in order to make those decisions in a measured and informed way. That's what governance really is at its heart.
So looking to the future, what kind of policy and legal reforms might help corporates avoid similar scenarios?
So this is a really interesting one because, of course, the concept of governance is really about, it's the rules through which organisations are managed. Some of those rules are given to you from the outside, i.e. legislative and regulatory frameworks, and those do need to be strong. Regulators need to be well resourced. There is absolutely a need for that. But most of the rules, in fact, I'd argue, are those that are set internally by the company itself. It's your policies and procedures. It's the way that you do things. Remembering that culture is like an iceberg. Only a little bit of it is visible from the surface in the written policies and procedures. A lot of it is the way that they're interpreted, the way that things are done on the ground day to day. It's often described as, what happens when nobody's checking on you. So those things are also very, very important. And I would suggest that having prescription about exactly what should happen in all circumstances is once again not necessarily good governance because it is very dependent on context. So what is right for company A is not necessarily right for company B. What's really important is that boards of directors and executives and managers, those that are involved in decision-making of the company, have the tools and equipment and knowledge to understand and appreciate the different mechanisms that they should be using to come to those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is what governance training is all about. We released a report yesterday that indicates, for example, that across the ASX listed 300 in Australia, that formal governance qualifications is actually diminishing as one of the qualification sets of directors. Now, this is a huge concern to us because corporate governance is not an entity, some technical field in itself. It's actually about having a broad understanding about all of the different frameworks that you need to have in place and a consideration of the different lenses through which you should make decisions. So that is concerning to us, that there is a delineation and almost more siloed approach to the way that you put boards together rather than a commonality of understanding about the different lenses through which you should make good decisions.
So ultimately, what I'm hearing is it's a tailored approach, and good governance comes down to having robust structures in place, strong communication, transparency, and safeguarding trust and confidence in these companies.
Absolutely. And that last point that you make is very much about accountability.
Mm-hmm.
Boards of directors have to have trust in executives, but with verification. And that means that, boards of directors do need to have their radar up for when they need to dig deeper and when they can feel comfortable with the attestations made by management.
We've been speaking with Megan Motto of the Governance Institute of Australia. Megan, thank you so much for your time today.
It's been great to talk to you.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.